the players here. St. Louis did their free agency work this year on the defensive side of the ball, did their draft day work on the offensive side of the ball. All day one selections were at skill positions, including the somewhat controversial selection of Lawrence Phillips to the Rams. Why was it controversial? If you are not familiar with the entire background of the Phillips situation, time to listen up as Andrea Kramer recounts it for us now.
Most teams had Lawrence Phillips as the highest-rated player on their draft boards. He was also one of the most scrutinized prospects in recent memory, as teams worked feverishly to determine if the assault of his former girlfriend was an isolated incident or indicated a pattern of uncontrollable anger and violence. Team security people went to Nebraska and spent time in his hometown of West Covina, California, talking to friends from as far back as 8th grade. Phillips' background had been investigated since many attributed his current problems to a difficult upbringing. Since age 12, without the stability of a mother or father, he had shuttled between a detention center and a shelter for abused and neglected children, before ending up in the state-supported Tina Max group home. His coach, Tom Osborne, was cognizant of his tough youth, and that was one reason he sent Phillips for a psychiatric evaluation at the Menninger Clinic in Kansas, following Phillips' suspension from the team. Osborne showed strong support for his former player. He even wrote to teams on his behalf.
He has sincerely examined his problem. I can't tell you that nothing will ever happen. The medical people that diagnosed him said it was primarily a situational thing. It was not something that they would predict necessarily would happen again and again. But he lost somebody in his life that was very important to him. He'd had some other losses earlier in his life that had been pretty devastating to him, and so he reacted very strongly. But it was not necessarily something that was going to be an ongoing pattern. So, and he absolutely had no evidence of psychosis or any type of mental dysfunction. So I mean, he can behave very normally, and so I think that he will do well, but no one can predict human behavior absolutely, and so if something would happen a year from now, I'm just giving him the best information that I have right now.
I think Lawrence Phillips is too much of a risk. At that point in the draft, I wouldn't touch him.
This is not a league of angels. There are people that have had problems, but they've gotten over them. I think this is a young man who will put this behind him and be a better football player.
St. Louis Rams select Lawrence Phillips, running back, Nebraska.
This is not the only running back in this draft.
No, but he's considered the best.
Well, he's considered. Are you evaluating him in totality?
Yes.
Okay.
I am.
Okay.
I am. I've evaluated him in totality.
Now, if he would have had a major reconstructive knee surgery, we would have factored that in.
But that's physical.
Okay. Well,
that's
I'm looking
the physical
at everything,
aspect.
Joe.
I mean, the mental aspect, I believe, is behind him.
First thing I'd like to do is give this, for the time being anyway, put this under Mr. Phillips's arm, because he's going to be carrying it for a lot of yards.
That the scene today in St. Louis as Rich Brooks welcomed Eddie Kennison, which was on Brooks's left, on our right, and Lawrence Phillips, the new running back of the St. Louis Rams. As we bring in Andrea Kramer, who's at Buccaneers headquarters, but worked on that piece, went to Nebraska to talk to Tom Osborne et al. Involving that story. Andrea, there's the public relations side of this now for Lawrence Phillips, not just for the St. Louis Rams, but for the individual as well.
Absolutely, and we heard earlier how someone mentioned that he traveled to St. Louis with a woman who was his media coach. Well, his agent, Mitch Frankel, has also hired a public relations, a woman who handles public relations. She, I guess, goes to work tomorrow on image enhancement. In fact, Lawrence is probably taking a page from Andre Agassi. Image is everything. Clearly, I think we heard Lawrence say that he loves to be on television. I think we could expect to see a lot of Lawrence Phillips just trying to get a positive image out there. Certainly, it doesn't appear that the Rams are that concerned about that. They, as everybody else did, researched his past rather thoroughly, and as I mentioned earlier, Steve Ortmeyer told me that he does not expect any backlash from the signing of Lawrence Phillips.
And Andrew, all we have to do is look at Michael Irvin in Dallas with the charges that have come up against him. There will be questions about how marketable he becomes after that. And tomorrow night on ESPN, Outside the Lines at 7:30 Eastern, Sports Inc., you will see in detail how the marketing of athletes individually, not as teams, but individually, has become a very significant financial part of their portfolio. Our coverage of the draft will continue from New York as the Rams, pondered for a while, decided to take the risk. The question is, will it be remembered as one of the great moves in draft history, taking Lawrence Phillips?
Volvo 850 Turbo and the brand new BMW 328i. 0 to 60, anyone? How about a quarter mile? The ultimate driving machine outdone by a Volvo wagon. Is nothing sacred?
Inside your engine, the dividing line between protection and destruction is a thin film of oil. Quaker State exceeds the highest standards for protection against thermal breakdown, volatility burn-off, corrosion. What's the state of your motor oil? Quaker State exceeds the highest standards for engine protection.
Look for the Quaker State 360 rebate during National Car Care Days, plus additional savings from these manufacturers at participating retailers.
Down there watching all the games that you'll see highlighted not just on SportsCenter but on RPM tonight here on the Deuce at 7 Eastern. We have the racing going on here on this Sunday. Here are the last 6 picks of the NFL draft, including Jeff Bucky, the offensive lineman from Stanford. Kid who won the high school national championship in the shot put and the discus, has operated at a variety of offensive positions and worked in a Bill Walsh system a couple of years there. So the player who Miami gets out of Stanford is not only a heady player but also a versatile offensive lineman. We have now another 22 picks remaining, and the drafting will be done, and then the teams will go about their minicamp business in late April and signing free agents. What if the draft was earlier, though? What if it happened a little bit closer to the end of the Super Bowl? Would it have an impact on the people in the NFL and doing all these background checks? Here are some observers' thoughts.
The benefit of it is that it would get the process over sooner for us and for the players. To the extent that the long workout season, which has now dawned in the National Football League, courtesy of the agents, would be cut perhaps by 2/3.
Traditionally, we have played late into January. So we don't have as much time, should I say, as perhaps a club that doesn't make the playoffs would have to prepare. And I would think that it doesn't serve anyone's purposes to have the teams, any number of teams, not as prepared as they could be when the draft comes around.
So it would clearly have different impacts depending how successful a regular season and postseason, how long that goes. Let's get some thoughts on what the impact of moving the draft might be as we check in with Chris Fowler in our studio. Chris?
Well, Mike, you can always count on Carmen Policy to bring up an interesting point. And as Mike Lombardi rejoins me, your former colleague there in San Francisco, does it penalize the teams that are successful to go to the Super Bowl by moving up the draft and saying that the draft would take place in early March, about a month and a half after the Super Bowl?
Well, I think the 49ers would have to rely on their personnel department, which does a good job in terms of getting the information they need. They would have to jump back into it. Moving the draft up means your personnel department is going to have to really be more involved with the draft. The coaches won't be able to get as involved as they had in the past because the time restrictions will be on them.
Yeah, what about a team like the Bengals that doesn't have a big scouting budget that uses their coaches a lot? Doesn't hurt a team like that as well as maybe the 49ers?
Well, I think it would hurt the Bengals a little bit more than it would the 49ers. The 49ers have a very large personnel department and a good staff. They can obviously get the information. The Bengals rely more on their coaches, so it's a little bit of a different situation for them. But it's going to come down to the team that's the most prepared after the bowl games for the draft.
And when the NFL does this is the direction they want to go. And I guess one benefit is it gives the personnel guys like you a little bit of a vacation because it moves the draft up. You can have more time before the start of minicamp. You can enjoy that.
Yeah, and I think it'll affect free agency to a degree because the players won't be assigned with the teams then. The draft will come in, then there'll be a market after that.
And it'll affect one thing on ESPN and ESPN2. It may cut into Dick Vitale's airtime just a bit in March Madness. Mike, back to you.
Just what we need right before championship week, the draft. This is under consideration by the National Football League, and somewhat serious consideration. It's not something that's just been floated out there. For example, people have floated out an idea of, let's play an 18-game regular season and a 2-game preseason. That hasn't been